The air in Chicago tasted different. It was the first thing Elara noticed, a concrete observation for a practical mind. In Iowa, the air had a flavor, a thick, humid melange of loam, corn silk, and distant rain. Here, it was a thin, metallic cocktail of bus exhaust, fried food from a corner stand, and the faint, fishy breath of Lake Michigan. It didn't fill the lungs, it scratched at them. Elara adjusted the strap of her overstuffed duffel bag, its canvas worn thin from years of farm use, now repurposed for this grand urban migration. She'd sold her old pickup truck to pay for the first month's rent on a studio apartment in Wicker Park, a neighborhood the online listing had described as vibrant and artistic. Standing on the corner of Damon and North Avenue, watching a man with a blue mohawk argue amiably with a woman walking 7 tiny dogs, she decided chaotic was a more accurate descriptor. Her new life was a series of spreadsheets. One for her new job as a junior data analyst at a mid-tier marketing firm, salary 401k match, projected career trajectory. Another for her monthly budget, rent, utilities, groceries with a painfully slim column for discretionary. A third, more secret one for her personal goals: assimilate, succeed. Do not, under any circumstances, get sentimental. Sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford. It was the thing that had kept her mother tethered to a dying farm and a broken-hearted man after Elara's older brother left. Sentiment didn't pay the bills or fix the tractor. Pragmatism did. Elara was all sharp edges and calculated decisions, her brown hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, her uniform of jeans and solid-colored t-shirts chosen for durability and anonymity. Her apartment was a shock. The studio was smaller than the farm's tool shed, a single room with a linoleum-floored kitchenette in one corner and a bathroom so small she could almost touch all 4 walls at once. The window looked out onto a brick wall. But it was clean and it was hers. She unpacked with methodical efficiency, placing her few worldly possessions, clothes, a set of good knives, a single photograph of her mother smiling in a sun hat, her laptop, in their designated spots. The emptiness was a comfort. It was a blank slate, free from the cloying weight of history. Later that week, lost on her way to the grocery store, she turned down an alley she'd later learn was called Graffiti Gallery. It wasn't a throughway, it was a canyon of art. Every inch of brick was covered in a riot of color and form, cartoonish monsters, photorealistic portraits, swirling abstract patterns, and jagged, cryptic script. It was the polar opposite of her spreadsheets. It was messy, emotional, gloriously inefficient. And in the center of the most prominent wall was a piece that made her stop dead. It was a girl rendered in stunning, hyperrealistic spray paint. She was kneeling, but instead of supplication, her posture was one of fierce, tender creation. From her hands, which were cupped together, grew not a flower but a tiny, perfect cityscape. Skyscrapers of silver and glass sprouted between her fingers, their roots tangling with the lifelines of her palms. Her face was tilted down, hidden by a fall of hair, but the intensity of her focus was palpable. The piece was titled, in small, elegant letters at the bottom, "The Sower." Elara stood there for a long time, the utilitarian loaf of bread and gallon of milk in her tote bag forgotten. It was the most illogical, beautiful thing she had ever seen. It made a strange, tight feeling bloom in her chest, a feeling she quickly identified and suppressed. Sentiment. She shook her head, a farmer dismissing a weather forecast for hope, and walked on. She didn't see the man watching her from a fire escape 3 stories up. He was shrouded in shadow, a sketchbook open on his knees. He didn't see a pragmatic data analyst. He saw a woman with a spine of steel and eyes that catalogued the world, standing before his work not with the usual awe or confusion, but with a deep, unsettling recognition. His charcoal pencil hovered over the page, then began to move, capturing not her likeness but her essence. The angle of her jaw, the set of her shoulders, the quiet, formidable strength of a thing deeply rooted even here in the concrete. His name was Kael, and to the city that devoured trends and spat them out, he was a ghost, a legend known only as Orpheus. And he had just found his Eurydice. Weeks bled into a month. Elara's life fell into a predictable rhythm. The crowded, lurching L train to the loop, hours spent optimizing click-through rates in a cubicle that smelled of stale coffee and desperation, the return journey, and a solitary evening in her studio, meal prepping for the next day. It was efficient. It was progress. It was, she had to admit to herself in the dark silence before sleep, profoundly lonely. Her only rebellion was her route home. She always went through the graffiti gallery. She told herself it was a shortcut, a more direct path than the crowded main sidewalks. But every time, her steps slowed as she passed the sewer. The image had lodged itself in her brain. It was an equation she couldn't solve, a variable that didn't fit her neatly constructed formulas. One Tuesday evening the piece was different. A vandal, or perhaps a rival, had slashed a jagged line of black paint across it, defacing the girl's hands, obscuring the burgeoning city. A jolt, sharp and entirely irrational, went through Elara. It felt like seeing someone trample a newly planted field. Without thinking, her pragmatic side offline, she dropped her tote bag and reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the ruined brick. It was just paint on a wall, she told herself. Illegal paint at that. But the destruction felt personal, an affront to the strange beauty that had become the one unpredictable constant in her new life. I wouldn't. The voice was low, gravelly, as if unused. It came from behind her, from the deep shadows near a dumpster. Elara spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. A man detached himself from the darkness. He was tall, wearing paint-stained cargo pants and a dark hoodie, the hood pulled up despite the mild evening. His face was all sharp angles and shadow, with a jaw tight with tension and eyes that were two pools of restless, intelligent night. He held a leather satchel slung over one shoulder, bulging with what she assumed were spray cans. "It's a crime scene, isn't it?" she retorted, her voice sharper than she intended, a defense mechanism. "I was just looking." "You look like you were about to perform CPR, he said, taking a step closer. His gaze flicked from her face to the defaced mural and back. There was an intensity in his look that was almost physical. "You're the one who stops here every day." She blinked, thrown. "How do you know that?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "This is my studio. I notice my audience." He gestured with his chin towards the wall. "What do you see in it?" It was such a direct, artist-like question. Elara, who dealt in data and definite answers, floundered for a moment. "I see a paradox," she said finally, the word surprising her. "Creation that's also a harvest. It's inefficient, but compelling." He stared at her for a long moment, and the air in the alley seemed to grow still. "Inefficient," he repeated, and this time the smile was more pronounced, a real thing that transformed his brooding face into something startlingly attractive. "No one's ever described my work that way before. I'm Kael." "Elara." "Elara," he said as if testing the name. He looked back at the ruined mural, his expression hardening. "It's gone. I never repaint the same thing twice." "That's wasteful," she said immediately, her farmer's daughter ethos kicking in. "You have a perfect stencil right there. Just cover the damage." He shook his head, a firm, final gesture. "The moment is gone. The emotion is gone. Repainting it would be a lie. It's a ghost now." He slung his satchel off his shoulder and unzipped it, the rattle of cans echoing in the narrow space. Time for a new ghost. He selected a can of primer, shook it with a violent, rhythmic clacking, and began to cover the entire piece, the girl with the city in her hands disappearing under a blanket of flat gray. Elara watched, a strange sense of loss knotting her stomach. She should leave. This was none of her business. This man was clearly unstable, an artist. But she didn't move. Kael worked with a furious, focused energy. He didn't sketch. He just looked at the blank wall for a full minute, his eyes seeing something she couldn't, and then he began. A mist of blue for a background, swift strokes of black to block in a form. He worked fast, the smell of aerosol sharp and chemical in the air. And as the new image began to emerge, Elara's breath caught in her throat. It was her. Not a photorealistic portrait, but an unmistakable essence. The ponytail was a streak of gold, the practical t-shirt rendered as a simple, strong tunic. The figure was standing on a precipice, looking out over a storm-racked sea, but one hand was held behind her, fingers curled around a single, sturdy stalk of wheat. The title, when he finished with a final, dramatic slash of white, was The Anchor. She was speechless. Her heart was a wild, fluttering thing against her spreadsheet-ordered ribs. "Why?" was all she could manage to whisper. Kael capped his can, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion. He looked at her, his dark eyes blazing with a captured fire. "Because you're the most solid thing I've seen in this city. You're real. And this city, it's built on ghosts and lies. I need to paint what's real." He shouldered his bag. "See you tomorrow, Elara." And he was gone, swallowed by the alley's mouth, leaving her alone with a version of herself she had never known existed, painted large on a brick wall for all of Chicago to see. The next 2 weeks were a surreal whirlwind. Elara's routine was shattered. She still went to work, still analyzed her data, but her mind was a fractured thing, constantly pulling away from pie charts to remember the smell of spray paint and the intensity in Kael's eyes. She went back to the alley. Of course she did. And he was often there, a brooding sentinel amidst his cans. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, but he watched her constantly, his artist's gaze dissecting her, absorbing her. He would ask her questions, strange, profound questions that had no place in her world. "What does the silence sound like out on your farm?" he'd ask while sketching her profile as she sat on an overturned crate. "It's not silent," she'd correct him, falling into his trap. "It's full of sound. Crickets, the wind in the corn, the hum of the generator. It's just different sound." He'd grunt, satisfied, and his pencil would fly across the page. He painted her again. This time, she was the compass, her hair whipping around her face as if in a great wind, her eyes looking forward with unerring certainty, while at her feet, a complex, beautiful clockwork of gears was hopelessly tangled in Iowa corn roots. People began to notice. The alley, always popular, became a destination. Art students and bloggers would congregate, pointing at the new Orpheus pieces, whispering about the mysterious, recurring muse. They took photos and Elara, ever pragmatic, would turn her face away. This wasn't her world. She was an observer, a reluctant participant in Kael's storm of creativity. One evening he was waiting for her, uncharacteristically agitated. "I need a new space. A bigger wall. I have an idea. It's the final one. The triptych needs to be complete." "Triptych?" she asked. The sower was the beginning. An idea. The anchor and the compass are the conflict. The push and pull. I need the resolution. He grabbed her hand, his fingers stained with paint, calloused and strong. "Come with me. I need you to see the place." His touch was electric. It was the first time he'd intentionally touched her, and it sent a shockwave up her arm that silenced all her internal warnings. She let him lead her out of the alley, through streets she didn't know, to a derelict warehouse overlooking the Chicago River. On its vast, blank side wall, facing the glittering towers of the Loop, was a canvas larger than her entire family's farmhouse. "Here," he said, his voice full of awe. "This is it. Kael, this is insane. It'll take you weeks. You'll get arrested." "Then I'll get arrested," he said, his gaze fixed on the wall. "But this needs to exist. With you in it." He started that night, under the cloak of darkness and the single watchful eye of a crescent moon. Elara became his accomplice. She'd come after work, bringing him coffee and sandwiches, acting as a lookout. She'd sit for hours watching him transform the massive wall. He'd built a complex system of scaffolding, and he moved over it with the fearless grace of a climber. The piece was his masterpiece. It was titled Concrete Blossoms. It depicted Elara, life-sized and breathtakingly detailed, walking through a canyon of Chicago skyscrapers. But from the pockets of her jeans tumbled not change or lint, but seeds. And where these seeds fell, miracles happened. Cracks in the sidewalk bloomed with sunflowers. Ivy scaled the glass and steel, not to destroy but to embrace. A giant oak tree, its leaves a brilliant gold, burst from the roof of a corporate high-rise. In her hand she held not a stalk of wheat, but a single, perfect paintbrush. She was both the farmer and the artist, the rural and the urban, the pragmatic and the beautiful. He had seen the core of her, the conflict she herself had refused to acknowledge, and he had painted a reconciliation. The night he finished, the city seemed to hold its breath. They stood together on the scaffolding, looking at the monumental work glowing in the city's ambient light. "It's us," Kael said quietly, his shoulder brushing hers. "You grounded me. You gave me something real to paint. I was just painting ghosts and anger before you." Elara looked from the painting to the man beside her. Paint was smudged on his cheek. His hands were raw. He had created this impossible, magnificent thing for her, about her. The last of her pragmatic defenses crumbled into dust. She reached up, her hand cupping his jaw, and turned his face to hers. "It's beautiful, Kael," she whispered. And then she kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision of two worlds, a release of weeks of pent-up tension, curiosity, and a longing so deep she hadn't even known it was there. It tasted of coffee, spray paint, and something entirely, wonderfully new. For a few glorious weeks, Elara lived in a dream. She balanced her data-driven days with passionate, unpredictable nights. She learned the landscape of Kael's cramped, paint-splattered loft, the way he hummed when he was thinking, the vulnerability he hid beneath his brooding exterior. He called her his cornerstone. She let him call her his muse. The problem with being a muse for a famous street artist, however, is that you eventually attract the attention of the world. It started with a blog post. Then a feature in the Chicago Tribune. Then a segment on a local news channel. Orpheus Unmasked? The mystery of the riverfront muse. The story wasn't just about the art, it was about her. They found out her name. They found out where she worked. A photographer snapped a picture of her and Kael leaving his loft, her face clear as day. Her boss called her into his office. Elara, this notoriety, it's not a good look for the firm. We deal in discretion. Data is quiet. He gave her a tight, disapproving smile. Perhaps you could ask your friend to paint over it? The spreadsheets in her life began to flash red. Her carefully constructed new identity was being overwritten by a narrative she hadn't authored. She was no longer Elara, the competent analyst. She was the muse, a romantic accessory to a brilliant man. The final blow came when a glossy art magazine published a long-form article about Kael. The writer had dug deep, interviewing old friends and rivals. And there, buried in the lyrical prose, was a quote from a former girlfriend, a gallery owner. Kael doesn't fall in love with women, she said. He falls in love with muses. He consumes their essence for his art until there's nothing left of them but a beautiful shell on a wall. Then he needs a new one. Elara read the article sitting at her kitchenette, the words burning into her soul. She looked at the photograph of Kael's previous series, which featured a ethereal-looking dancer. The article named her. It described how she'd had a breakdown after he left her, how her career had never recovered. It all clicked into place with the cold, hard logic she had always trusted. Her paradox, her anchor, her compass, it was all just raw material. She was just the latest in a line of women used to fuel the legend of Orpheus. The kiss, the whispered words, the feeling of being seen, it was all part of the creative process for him. She was a human spreadsheet to him, a collection of interesting traits to be graphed onto a wall. When he came to her door that night, his eyes alight with a new idea, she was waiting. Her bag was packed. The farm girl practicality had reasserted itself with a vengeance, armored in heartbreak. Elara, I've got it, a new series we could. I'm not your we, Kael, she interrupted, her voice flat, devoid of all the emotion that was tearing her apart inside. I'm not your muse. I'm a person. And you've used me up. The light in his eyes died. What are you talking about? Used you? You inspired me. You saved me. She held up the magazine, open to the damning quote. Did you say this? About Lila the dancer? That she was a beautiful shell? Kael's face paled. That was taken out of context. That was years ago. I was different. No, Elara said, shouldering her bag. The same duffel she'd arrived with. It felt heavier now. I think that's the most honest you've ever been. You don't love me. You love what I represent. A concept. A ghost for your wall. Elara, please. What we have is real. Is it? She looked at him, and for the first time she let him see the raw hurt in her eyes. Then prove it. Paint over concrete blossoms. Erase me. If I'm real to you and not just a muse, you'll be able to let me go and let the art stand. If I'm just a concept, you'll never paint over your masterpiece. It was an impossible, brutal choice. To destroy his greatest work to prove his love, or to keep it and confirm her worst fears. Kael stared at her, his artist's soul recoiling from the ultimatum. I can't, he whispered, horrified. You're asking me to destroy beauty? Truth. No, Elara said, walking past him and out the door. I'm asking you to choose. And you just did. She left him standing in the hallway, the door closing with a soft, final click. The farm in Iowa was exactly as she'd left it, quiet, sprawling, and smelling of honest dirt. Her mother welcomed her back without questions, her eyes full of a knowing sadness. Elara threw herself into the physical labor, mending fences, baling hay, canning vegetables. The work was hard and clean. It didn't leave room for thinking, for analyzing the wreckage of her Chicago life. She deleted her social media. She ignored emails from Chicago, from her old job offering her position back, from unknown numbers she knew were Kael. She tried to become the person she was before, the one defined by pragmatism, not passion. But she was different. The silence here was now just silence. The work was just work. She missed the chaos, the color, the feeling of being alive. She missed him. It was a constant, aching hum beneath her ribs. Weeks turned into a month. One afternoon, her mother handed her a tablet. Saw this online. Thought you should see. It was a link to a Chicago art blog. The headline read, Orpheus's Greatest Sacrifice, The Erasure of Concrete Blossoms. With trembling fingers, Elara clicked the link. There were pictures. Time-lapse photos. They showed Kael, alone on the scaffolding, a roller in his hand, covering his magnificent masterpiece with a coat of flat, neutral gray primer. The article was full of speculation. Why had he done it? Was it a new artistic statement? A protest? But Elara knew. He had painted over it. For her. The article ended with a quote from an anonymous source, which Elara knew with every fiber of her being was from Kael. Some art isn't meant to live on a wall. It's meant to live in a person. I had to let the blossom go so the root could grow. She sat on the porch steps, the tablet in her lap, and cried for the first time since she was a little girl. She cried for the beautiful, destroyed painting. She cried for the lonely, brilliant man. She cried for the part of herself she had left in that city. He had chosen her. Not the concept, not the muse, but her. Pragmatism, she realized, wasn't about avoiding feeling. It was about correctly identifying the most valuable asset. And love, real, messy, inconvenient love, was the highest ROI of all. She found him not in the graffiti gallery, but at the riverfront, standing before the vast, gray wall. It was a blank slate, a ghost of what had been, but somehow, it was more powerful in its emptiness. It was a promise. He turned as she approached, as if he'd felt her presence from a mile away. He looked older, thinner, but the brooding intensity in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady calm. "You came back," he said. There was no accusation, only wonder. "You painted it over," she replied, stopping a few feet from him. "It was the easiest hard decision I ever made," he said. "The art was nothing without the artist. And you were my collaborator, Elara. Not my muse. My partner. I was too much of a fool to see the difference." The Chicago wind whipped off the river, tugging at her hair, which she'd left down. She wasn't the same woman who had left. She was someone new, someone who carried the farm in her heart and the city on her skin. "I don't want to be your inspiration, Kael," she said. "I want to be your equal. I have my own creations." She gestured to the blank wall. "And so do you." He reached into his satchel and pulled out not a spray can, but a small, simple brush and a tiny pot of paint. He walked to the wall, to a spot at the very bottom, near the sidewalk, untouched by the gray primer. He knelt down and with a few swift strokes, he painted a single perfect stalk of wheat, its head heavy with seed. Then he stood back and handed the brush to her. Elara took it. She dipped it in the paint, a rich, earthy brown, and knelt beside his wheat. She painted, not a cityscape but a strong, simple root, tangling with the base of his stalk. It was a small, simple thing on the massive wall. The beginning of something new. Not a masterpiece for the world, but a private promise between them. Kael took her hand, his paint-stained fingers lacing with her practical, strong ones. Together they looked at their small shared creation, a concrete blossom of a different kind, and for the first time, both of them were exactly where they were meant to be.